Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all here and to see so many departmental colleagues. This is the last of the public presentations from the fellows from this year's Humanities Center Fellows group that have been, our faculty and graduate student fellows have been collaborating all year on the theme of viral culture. And I've been privileged to participate in that group as a participant observer, where faculty shared research and bibliography and work in progress, and everybody had the opportunity in collaboration with another or other fellows to have an occasion like this and share the some of the fruits of our study together. And collaboration is really fun and immensely fruitful and interesting, and it is also about fellowship in all the senses of that word. So I just want to appreciate that and appreciate the Humanities Center for having this structure to enable us to collaborate. All of which is the prelude to a pitch for, at the back of your programs, the actual culminating event of the viral culture program, as well as the culminating event for the Humanities Center this year, is on effective collaborations across the disciplines, which is the work that we do. In particular, we're interested in refining the role of institutional centers and networks. There is a full-day occasion, though you should feel free to come to any or all of it on Thursday, April 3rd from 10:30 to 3. In particular, there's a keynote at 11 by Kathleen Woodward from the University of Washington, who is among the experts in the field, who's long directed one of the most successful humanities centers, and she will be speaking on collaboration, mechanisms, models, new media. We will, the fellows themselves will present a website that they've developed that features the individual projects. They'll talk about the experience of collaboration. I really would encourage you to, we need RSVPs, everybody's welcome, but we want responses so that we can cater appropriately. So you want to respond for that reason, so that there's enough wonderful food. But this is really a pitch. Please come on April 3rd and help us publicize it and encourage our colleagues to come. Today's program is actually language and literature piece. It's the viral metaphor, the circulation of cultural narratives. We've been exploring the metaphor of virality. What does it mean, this virality thing? In the 19th century, how did things go viral? What about the effects of virality on the web? We've had multiple investigations of this idea of virality, and now we're talking about the circulation of genre, of thought, of ideas. The bios of Nicole Aljoe and Lana Cook are provided for you. I won't read them, but I will read the titles. Nicole Aljoe, who is faculty in the English department, will be speaking about traveling genre, virality, and the neo-slave narrative. And Lana Cook, almost PhD, will be talking about psychedelic virality, the aesthetic contagion of altered states, LSD. And that project's been really fun. So without further ado, with further ado, this is unrelated to the Humanities Center, but since I'm standing here and I wear many hats, you were handed another piece of promotional material for a week of activities, co-sponsored by the Humanities Center actually, but for Holocaust Awareness Week next week. I particularly want to draw your attention to the event on Tuesday night, which is kind of an amazing all-star cast on the question of, it's called Masterpieces of Moral Justice, who was heir to plundered art. And it's about, it's the real world questions of monuments men, and about legacy, restitution, who owns what, after how long, and really the leading national experts, including the curator for provenance at the MFA, will be a panel discussing the subject. Try to get the word out about that. Again, the publicity has been a little late, so if you would help us spread the word and come yourself, we would be very grateful. So that's the last plug, and without further ado, Nicole.
Great. Hello. Good afternoon. So the project that I've been working on as part of this year's Humanities Center Biocultural theme is titled, Do You Remember the Days of Slavery? The Neo-Slave Narrative in Contemporary Caribbean Cultural Production. It examines the formal, aesthetic, political, and social resonances of the post-colonial neo-slave narrative genre by focusing on a case study of Caribbean texts. Neo-slave narratives are currently understood as, quote, contemporary novels that assume the form, adopt the conventions, and take on the first-person voice of the antebellum slave narrative, end quote. These contemporary fictional works, which take slavery as their subject matter and usually feature enslaved protagonists, are often characterized by explicit engagements with the material history of the enslavement of human beings. Things such as detailing the daily experiences and accounts of victimizations and rebellions, meditations on the concepts of freedom and enslavement, notions of voice, or articulating notions of voice linked to identity, and these are just a few of the most prevalent conventions that you usually see in neo-slave narratives. And while it is certainly true that the vast majority of neo-slave narratives, like the historical narratives, have been produced in the United States, a significant number have been written in a variety of locations across the globe. Neo-slave narratives have been written and produced in the Caribbean, such as Maurice Condé's I Tituba, Orlando Patterson's The Children of Sisyphus, Christina Garcia's Monkey Hunting, Dion Brand's At the Full and Change of the Moon, in South Africa, such as Yvette Christian's Unconfessed, Manu Herbstein's Ama, A Story of the African Slave Trade. In Nigeria, there's Shaihu Umar, which was written by the first federal prime minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, as well as Bushi Emecheta's novel Slave Girl. And then I've also added, I found out recently, about two more texts from South Asia that talk about slavery and indentureship in India, specifically those two novels. And yet, despite the knowledge of the globality of the institutions of enslavement, the overwhelming majority of scholarship on neo-slave narrative genre focuses on texts produced in the United States. Indeed, the definition of the genre seems itself grounded in the U.S. context of enslavement and its use of the term antebellum, which refers right to the Civil War. The earliest definition of the term, which is below this by Bernard Bell, is, quote, residually oral modern narratives of escape from bondage to freedom, right? This also reinforces a U.S. context in its focus on defining neo-slave narratives as fictional texts about escape and about the movement from bondage to freedom. So now acknowledging that there might be other movements in the neo-slave narratives. And while important work has been done in terms of highlighting the ways in which some neo-slave narratives aim to challenge structural racisms in the United States, the genre's relationships to issues of colonialism and neocolonialism have not been as extensively explored. Indeed, although there may be structural and metaphorical similarities between the positioning of African Americans within US society and the power relationships between colonizer and colonized, both experiences are not interchangeable or exact equivalencies. The majority of post-bellum conversations about African American culture in the United States have been about integration, so focused on facilitating and acknowledging the presence of blackness within the United States cultural imaginary and history, while conversations in the formerly colonized nations are primarily ones of disintegration in the wake of national independence movements and assertions of unique post-colonial ideologies. As many scholars have pointed out, the institution of slavery in the Caribbean was distinct from that in the United States. To name just a few of the historical distinctions, in addition to the context of colonialism, many more of the enslaved in the Caribbean were brought directly from Africa. There was greater linguistic and cultural diversity across the various islands, and much greater prevalence of absentee ownership, meaning that the plantations were actually owned by Their owners actually lived in England or France or the Netherlands, somewhere else, but not in the actual Caribbean. There are also distinctions in the contemporary engagements with the history of colonial slavery. So for example, the day-to-day physical presence of the material history of slavery is greater in the Caribbean. Just to give you a couple of examples of that, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, she's a Cuban visual artist, talks about growing up in what used to be slave barracoons. The experience of actually growing up in a slave house. There are numerous middle-class residential housing schemes that are built on and named after sugar plantations. And one can also still see groups of men and women cutting canes with machetes in the Caribbean. There's also, obviously, post-colonial geopolitics, as well as, most importantly, the lack of an explicit slave narrative tradition. There is a retrospective one, which if you're curious about, you can go and buy my book, which discusses that. These distinctions are emblematic of the diversity of the institutions of enslavement. As Paul Gilroy has argued in The Black Atlantic, the international story of slavery cannot be understood as primarily national narratives. African Atlantic slavery, like contemporary slavery, was a global institution. Focusing on slavery as a singular national narrative invested in inserting its inclusion within and problematizing larger international dialogues of US literary and social historical history makes it easier to overlook the global aspects of the institution of enslavement. My aim here is not to critique US narratives for privileging the US context, but to acknowledge the significant distinctions that experiences of colonialism has had on social, political, and aesthetic developments in post-colonial nations, as well as to suggest that this distinction is worth analyzing because it helps us to develop a better understanding of the genre. So at the heart of the study are two broad questions that bear on the theme of viral culture. First, how and why do genres travel across the globe? And then second, how and why do they travel amongst different media? Initially, I was convinced that virality was an apt metaphor for the circulation of neo-slave narratives, primarily because it echoed the 18th and 19th century circulations of historical slave narratives through public and private print networks, some of which you saw in Ryan Cordell's work on the circulation of 19th century print culture. But the wide and pervasive circulation of the genre offered a useful image for communicating the multiplicity of the genre. And yet, as the seminar went on, I began to question whether virality was indeed a useful metaphor for this project. Contemporary understandings of virality, or more specifically, virality 2.0, and this name comes from Robert Payne's essay of the same name, like Web 2.0, is primarily about users sharing information. Something goes viral because many people circulate it. One of the questions that kept coming up in our fellowship meetings was when something goes viral, or at what number can something be considered or defined as having gone viral. The answer, of course, is it depends on the context, but it's primarily a numbers game, a popularity contest. On significant numbers, this is always a sliding scale, right? Say it has gone viral, it has gone viral. As connected to my project, it seemed exceedingly problematic to say that the progressive circulation and sharing of things like the ICANN Has Cheeseburger website, whose sole objective was to collect the greatest numbers of hits, was useful in any way for understanding the circulation of neo-slave narratives. So while on the one hand, some aspects of the circulation of the neo-slave narrative as a genre could be traced to the popularity of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, that came out in 1987, the fact that since 2007, no less than 5 Caribbean writers have published neo-slave narrative novels. Unburnable by Maria Helena John, 2007, The Book of the Night Women by Marlon James, Long Song, Andrew Levy, The Island Beneath the Sea, Isabel Allende, and Evelyn Trio's The Infamous Rosalie, which came out in 2012. Calls out to be read as more than mere market coincidence or popularity. The vast linguistic and stylistic differentiation within even this very short list of texts in English, Spanish, and French, a popular ethnic urban love story, a postmodern colonial Gothic. There are 2 historical romances in that list, one embracing magical realism, the other embracing social realism, suggests that the circulation of the neo-slave narrative genre needs to be understood in ways beyond progressive popularity or adaptation. Moreover, this diversity seems to suggest that maybe the Caribbean texts were not imitating or adapting Morrison, but rather transforming the genre. My unease with the viral 2.0 metaphor was compounded when I thought about what made the Caribbean narratives distinctive. One of the key distinctions was a lack of an explicit and formal slave narrative tradition. Because such a tradition formally and explicitly exists in the US, right, and the genre was discussed as a distinct genre, even in the mid-19th century, so it's pretty much been its own genre for a while. Most, if not all, US slave narratives, or neo-slave narratives, are forced to engage with that tradition. Consider the furors around, Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, right? Edward Jones's Known World, Kara Walker's work, Django Unchained, right? 12 Years a Slave, right? This idea that there is a proper way to narrate the story of enslavement, and that these examples are all not proper. The absence of such a tradition might have made it more possible for contemporary Caribbean artists to feel free to revise and reframe or creolize the neo-slave narrative. Indeed, many more works by Caribbean artists seem invested in creating alternative versions of the neo-slave narrative. So what do some of these alternative versions look like? I talked earlier about the distinction that the experience of colonialism makes. Two examples are to be found in Carpentier's The Kingdom of This World and Jean Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea. Kingdom of This World was published in 1949, Rhys's Wide Sargasso Sea is 1966. So they're both written during the colonial and immediate post-colonial eras, which comes to a formal end in the Caribbean, specifically in Jamaica and Trinidad in 1962, not counting Haiti, of course. While both texts are concerned with highlighting the social impacts of enslavement, they also map the very different registers of slavery and political discourse outside of the US context. More specifically, both Sargasso Sea and Kingdom challenge notions of enlightenment subjectivity by explicitly rewriting European canonical texts and foundational ideologies. Kingdom rewrites mid-century notions of postmodernism and existentialism, and Sargasso rewrites Bronte's Jane Eyre, or we can say it rewrites Bronte's Jane Eyre. One of the things it does is rewrite Bronte's Jane Eyre, and Victorian assumptions about colonial identities. Moreover, both novels situate themselves in explicit opposition to European cultural traditions. Carpentier through an employment of magical realism, Rhys through her articulation of what we might call feminist Creole postmodernism. And there are obviously other ways in which they do these things as well. Written during the circulation of conversations about Pan-Caribbean identities via organizations such as the West Indies Federation, the New World and Caribbean artist movements, both novels construct modern romantic heroes and heroines that challenge and triumph over colonizing ideologies and assert new proto and post-colonial ideologies that embrace romantic notions of freedom and Creole or hybrid, authentically Caribbean identities. In more contemporary texts, given the prevailing assumption of the lack of an authentic, self-written Caribbean slave narratives, one might assume that these texts might also aim to provide authentic or realistic voices on behalf of those who were previously marginalized. And while certainly some Caribbean texts, such as Fred Daguzar's Feeding the Ghosts and Evelyn Trio's Rosalie l'Infâme, Rosalie the Infamous, do draw heavily upon historical realism and romanticism, there are those that make other surprising aesthetic choices. For example, in terms of representations of Europe, many post-colonial neo-slave narratives, such as the Book of the Night Women or the Long Song, Europe is relegated to the background, or it's textually absent, occasionally articulated as a ghostly presence haunting both the text and the characters throughout. Though like the earlier texts, the later novels illuminate the horrors of colonial slavery, they're also more frequently focused on the entangled power relationships inherent to the Caribbean slave system and highlight the paradoxes within 18th and 19th century colonial societies. Rather than articulate progressive romantic movements toward authentic or incipient freedoms, the texts also communicate more complex notions of freedom as well as voice. Indeed, although most of the post-colonial texts appropriate the often first-person narration associated with the historical slave narratives, the Caribbean texts also often incorporate a variety of different narrative formats and techniques, including multiple and unreliable narrators, which we see in Wide Sargasso Sea, Aititiba, and the Long Song, as just a couple of examples. Moreover, many of these neo-slave narratives are not always grounded in psychological or social realism, or the singular autobiographical format often associated with the genre. Again, I'm not saying that US narratives don't do this, I'm saying that the Caribbean narratives do these in a different kind of way. So for example, Nalo Hopkinson's novel The Salt Roads from 2004 draws on the genre of speculative, fantasy, and science fiction. Other Caribbean neo-slave narratives also draw upon the unusual formats of the folk tale and the young adult novel. and Novazy Phillips' novel, Harriet's Daughter, is a young adult novel that takes up the story of slavery. And while the postcolonial narratives are also invested in providing descriptions of the specificity and distinction of slavery in the Caribbean, they also seem to be asking new and different questions about the history of slavery and its contemporary resonances. In particular, many of the texts seem intent on complicating the notion of social death, frequently associated with understandings of racial bondage that predominantly portray the world and psychology of the enslaved person as one solely of lack, negation, and powerlessness. And think about the fact that no one seems to be discussing a scene in 12 Years a Slave where Patsy is shown in that beautiful field, right, making dolls. The focus seems to obsessively, right, be on her sexual, physical, and mental torture. In Slavery and Social Death, sociologist Orlando Patterson argued that in order to facilitate and normalize the enslavement of Africans, a whole host of ideologies and discourses were consciously and unconsciously manipulated, developed and deployed to represent Africans as subhuman and outside of normal family and social relations, and therefore natural slaves. More recent scholarship, such as that by historians Vincent Brown and Jenny Shaw, has asserted that scholars have too eagerly taken up Patterson's notion of social death and used it to rigidly define and regulate representations of enslaved human beings. Similar to the work of historians of Caribbean slavery, then, the fictional narratives aim to complicate notions about the worlds of enslaved African human beings by revealing the complexly nuanced ways in which they reconstituted and created new societies and nations in the Caribbean. One of the key conventions in the neo-slave narrative, beyond their engagement with colonialism and history, is its connection to the present. Several scholars have illuminated the ways in which the genre was influenced by and had an impact on the social movements of civil and post-civil rights movement. Similar connections between the past and the present are apparent in Caribbean neo-slave narratives. And again, as with the other conventions of the genre, the distinction of the Caribbean post-colonial context alters that genre. In particular, many recent Caribbean neo-slave narratives are invested in highlighting the similarities and relationships between contemporary power imbalances in the Caribbean with those in the past. So for example, Levy's novel The Long Song records the rescue of only the protagonist from the slavery-like experiences of the apprenticeship period. Although it might have been wishful thinking to expect July's son, July's the protagonist, the main character, to save all of the apprentices, it is striking that no mention is made of the other apprentices who remain in semi-bondage, nor is any attention paid to detailing the community with whom July had been living. In addition to revealing mutations in definitions of family, from the wider non-community family apparent during enslavement and apprenticeship into the tighter kinship circle of July's son and his family in the post-emancipation era, the novel also seems to critique this elevation of the personal over the communal. In offering this critique of the privileging of the personal, Levy's novel resonates with the, quote, hell in the handbasket, communalism under colonialism was better, rhetoric of the public comment section of most, if not all, contemporary Caribbean newspapers. So there are always these letters that say, you know, life was much better under colonialism when everyone took care of each other, that kind of thing. And so that seems to be similar to the critique that Levy is making here, or at least speaks to it. I've lost my place now. As well as the rise in gated communities and personal security companies intended to facilitate the increasing separation of classes in the contemporary Caribbean. So the argument is that, right, this focus on individual over the community, right, is making the situation in which people feel comfortable living in these gated communities, basically. In recording the complexities of perspectives during the colonial emancipation periods, Levy's novel highlights the ways in which these relationships of enslavement continue to structure post-colonial Caribbean societies. Indeed, the most recent proliferation of neo-slave narrative novels coincides with recent calls for reparations for slavery in the Caribbean. And on Monday, so this past Monday, 15 Caribbean nations revealed their 10-point plan during the meeting of CARICOM, which is basically a version of the European Economic Union. So they've released a 10-point plan. And in a departure from the fiery recriminations and calls for Europe to pay recompense to the descendants of slaves of the early decolonization era, as exemplified by Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery, which was written in 1944. The current rhetoric of reparations, which interestingly was written by another Caribbean historian of slavery, Sir Hilary Beckles of Barbados, whose, fun fact, ancestors were owned by Benedict Cumberbatch's ancestors. Supposedly this is why he took the part in 12 Years a Slave. But anyway, so the current rhetoric is being framed not as punishments for the formerly colonizing nations, so they are not requesting billions of dollars from the European former colonizers, despite whatever the Daily Mail may say, but as the socialist humanist acknowledgement of the real and continuing structural effects of the historical institution. The diversity of the manifestations and developments of the neo-slave narrative in the Caribbean confirms that Caribbean texts do not just imitate or adapt Morrison's or other American neo-slave narratives, but rather shift or alter the genre and the content to convey different themes, different questions, and different concerns. Generic shifts are basically understood as occurring when the genre in question changes shape and pushes past its limits through encounters with new contents and forms. And once again, we are back to the figure of the virus. The generic shifts or alterations in neo-slave narrative seem to echo, right, the mutation and alteration of viruses. And actually, Lana, can you pass out?
She did.
Oh, she did. Oh, cool. Okay. Let me see. However, rather than mere sharing, this version of virality has more in common with the term's initial definition in epidemiology as an entity spread by contact and which could change its form depending on the host. Encouraged by readings shared by my more scientifically trained colleagues in the fellowship group, so readings about R-naught and scientific methods and development of laboratories, it began to seem as though this initial understanding of virality, so virality 1.0, if you will, could operate as a useful, meaningful chronotope. Chronotope is basically defined as a representative figure meant to articulate the materiality and fusion of both time and space. So it's allowing me to talk about the historical narratives without it degenerating into a teleological kind of argument, but also capturing the more fluid, rhizomatic, rather than progressive understanding of the genre circulation across the globe. Drawing on the initial definition of virality also highlighted the process of alteration and mutation necessitated by the host population. Moreover, this version of virality, unlike the sharing version, could also accommodate the genre's engagement with contemporary social political action. So just as in the 18th and 19th century, when slavery was characterized as an insidious and ravenous disease that must be eradicated through social action, facilitated after reading slave narratives, the historical slave narratives, contemporary discourse about modern slavery also relies upon the rhetoric of disease. Historian Kevin Bales, founder of Free the Slaves, author of Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy, and a leading force behind the recently released Global Index of Modern Slavery, which counted 29 million enslaved individuals globally today, which is more than in the past. Remember, 2 to 6 million slaves were imported from Africa, but this was over 200 years of the slave trade. Has said that quote, the accurate labeling and tracking of the disease of slavery is the first step in beating it. He continues, it's a lot like epidemiology, he said, and we have to get in there and vaccinate, but first we have to figure out where the disease is and what are the risk factors. So in the same way that you do with an epidemic, it's not always in the same place. There are different supporting factors. In offering commentary on the connections between historical and modern versions of enslavement, the Caribbean narratives not only echo its historical antecedents, but also reveal nuanced understandings of the interconnectedness of power and discourse, suggesting the necessity for new ways to combat modern global enslavement. This version of virality as a chronotope, which foregrounds more complicated perspectives about the institution of enslavement and its continuing effects, is also helpful for understanding how and why contemporary visual artists, musicians, and architects also appropriate the genre, translating it into non-textually based media, as in films such as Dance Hall Queen and Get a Life, as well as visual art by Annalee Davis, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, Ebony Patterson, and Jocelyn Gardner. And what these works tend to have in common is that they comment on the relationship between racial bondage, global capitalism, and wage slavery. These para and extra literary texts frequently use the neo-slave narrative forms, themes, and aesthetics to highlight the pervasiveness of the continuing impacts of enslavement. And in so doing, I want to argue in the larger project, underscore the viral malleability of the genre, as well as the possibility of jumping to dissimilar media. And just as an example, this is Annalee Davis's video piece, Identities Withheld by Choice. She also has a related series called Migrant Discourse. It records interviews with several Caribbean migrant workers. The video offers direct commentary on the passage of 2001 of Article 45 of the revised Treaty of Chagarumas, which was signed by CARICOM, which was intended to implement free movement of Caribbean nationals between the 14 member CARICOM islands. But it's never been put into practice, never been, so you still need papers. It's still incredibly difficult. And if you don't have papers, obviously, it's incredibly difficult. So the testimonies of the migrants who move from island to island seeking work without official papers and consequently live and must be filmed in disguise and shadow offers an eerie echo of the 18th and 19th century testimonies of enslaved individuals. Like their economic forebears, they reveal the entrenched nature of forced labor that effectively disenfranchise significant numbers of contemporary Caribbean peoples, whose stories can only be told obliquely. Focusing on global permutations of the neo-slave narrative through a case study of Caribbean texts enables us to better appreciate the viral rhizomatic permutations of the genre and its circulation. Additionally, it highlights the significance of change and mutation to considerations of genre. Privileging and confining the prior understandings of the neo-slave narrative has become unuseful and very unhelpful because of its connections to static histories of US exceptionalism. To constrict the rhetorical range and understanding of fictional narratives of enslavement facilitates overlooking contemporary permutations of enslavement. And as terrible as it sounds, we must acknowledge that there are many stories of enslavement. And yet these stories, while certainly revealing the sheer horror of the experiences of enslavement, also speak powerfully to the creative and generative power of resilience and cultural transcendence across the African diaspora. Thank you.
So I'd like to share my gratitude to the Humanities Center, the Dean's Office, and the college for the tremendous gift of time in this last year. It can't be understated. I also want to thank my peers and mentors in the English department by way of an announcement. So what's this? The English Graduate Student Association is hosting its annual conference 2 weeks from now, Friday, March 28th, and Saturday, March 29th. This year's conference is the Spectacular, and it will feature Theo Davis as our faculty keynote and Wendy Hesford from Ohio State University as our keynote speaker. The Spectacular explores the dynamics of spectacle in visual, literary, performative arts. You can view the event schedule on the website and follow us on Twitter as well. And then lastly, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the fellowship group for pushing my thinking on a project that really intersects the arts and the sciences in a myriad of ways that you're going to see in this presentation. So I'd like to start with a question. How did LSD become LSD? So throughout World War II, and is appearing as late as 1958, those three letters, LSD, appeared sporadically in American newspapers. The acronym referred only, though, to the naval term, landing ships dock. However, a few years later, newspapers were full of headlines reading, LSD kills 20. LSD was suddenly a national threat and a generational craze. What happened in the course of those few years that put LSD so prominently on the cultural map? Why did LSD go viral? Over the course of this fellowship year, psychedelic culture has served as my test case for theories of virality. Interest in psychedelics seems to have spread rapidly across the American landscape in the 1960s. The virality model helps to capture the speed of that spread, the massive distribution, and the transnational scope of psychedelic culture during the era. But like Nicole, I'm mixed about the effectiveness of this metaphor. What is added to understanding when we apply this key term, viral, over traditional terms like distribution or circulation? In their recent book, Going Viral, Karine Nahoon and Jeff Hamsley give a good working definition of virality, which I'll quote in full. Virality is a social information flow process where many people simultaneously forward a specific information item over a short period of time within their social networks, and where the message spreads beyond their own social networks to different, often distant networks, resulting in a sharp acceleration in the number of people who are exposed to the message. Nahoon and Helmsley help us understand the infrastructural conditions required to accelerate the rate and scope of diffuse viral spread. Yet many questions remain for me as I try to apply the virality model to psychedelic cultural history. What is the cutoff for virality? How many people? How short of time? How sharp of acceleration? The next major stage of this project is to mine the enormous yet only partially digitized corpus of mid-20th century media to map out those psychedelic references across time and space. It's a major undertaking. So my attention this year has been on the people in those social networks, the art, which serve as the viral vehicles, and the richly effective messages that passed along during this turbulent decade. Today I'm going to tell you a story about why some ideas spread and how a generation suddenly turned on to a new vision of reality. I'm focusing on a narrow slice of the United States psychedelic history that characterized the sort of 60s hippie generation as we know it. Psychedelic culture has appeared in many forms from the start of human civilization, transcending cultural and national boundaries. To give you a brief background, by psychedelics, I mean the class of natural and chemical substances that, when ingested, affect the brain's serotonin and dopamine levels, often producing perceptual changes in thought, mood, and vision, otherwise rarely experienced. So these altered states are changed from your ordinary consciousness. These altered states are sometimes similar to those of dreams, meditative and trance states, religious exaltation, flashbulb memories, and acute mental disorder. Psychedelics are, according to current research, non-addictive and have few physiological effects, much unlike popular drugs like opioids, amphetamines, heroin, and cocaine. There are many documented psychedelic substances, but the most well-known and the most relevant to today's story are LSD, mescaline, peyote, psilocybin, and DMT. The effects of psychedelics are highly dependent on an individual's mindset, preparation, and environment, or as Timothy Leary famously described it, the set and setting. Those psychedelic experiences are highly relative and varied, as the online trip database Erowid will show you. There are a few constants that we can use to effectively classify these drugs. Many experience heightened sensations of light, color, form, and movement. Others perceive non-material forms, vibrations of energy, and auras of shimmering light. Some observe complex networks of interconnection, pattern, and flow. Visual alterations depend highly on dosage. Low doses tend to produce a heightened state of ordinary perception, like a vase of flowers will seem richer in color. The leaves might kind of breathe or pulse. Higher doses can produce intense feelings of bodily transfiguration and fantastic landscapes, as shown in one woman's account. Suddenly, my body was shaken by a terrific force, as if by a machine used for mixing paint. Something told me the shaking indicated the beginnings of a new life. Immediately, I became a magnificent feminine Pegasus. I had huge wings of snow-white feathers laid in perfect symmetry, dainty shell-pink nostrils, and large liquid blue eyes. My opalescent hoofs were of iridescent mother of pearl. We often associate psychedelics with visual hallucinations, but emotions actually play a central role in most psychedelic experiences. Psychedelics can produce tremendous waves of joy, ecstasy, peace, and compassion, but also periods of intense paranoia and terror. Users often report they feel part of a universal or cosmic order, experiencing strong feelings of global awareness and empathy towards others. Today, I'd like us to look at how psychedelic aesthetics, the literature, film, and art of altered states, offered up a nation a beautiful, illuminating, sometimes terrifying escape, sacrament, and tool. And America ate it up in droves. You'll see a familiar cast of cult characters and some forgotten figures that I'd like to restore to the canon. So what happened in the 60s? How did the nation go from Dick Clark's American Bandstand to Beatles' Sgt. Pepper? What inspired the Summer of Love, and what caused the acid panic of the 60s? We start in Switzerland in 1938. In the midst of the Second World War, chemist Albert Hofmann was working in the lab on a new synthetic compound derived from the fungus ergot, which grows on rye and other grains. Hofmann was the first to synthesize lysergic acid diethylamide, more commonly known as LSD-25. He did not realize its psychedelic effects initially. It took a little while. In popular lore, the discovery was by sheer accident. While working on the crystallizations and inadvertently getting some on his fingertips, to give you a sense of the potency, Hofmann began to feel a bit disoriented. He wrote to his supervisor later, Last Friday, April 16th, 1943, I was forced to interrupt my work in the laboratory in the middle of the afternoon and proceed home, being affected by a remarkable restlessness combined with a slight dizziness. At home, I lay down and sank into a not unpleasant intoxicated-like condition, characterized by an extremely stimulated imagination. In a dreamlike state, with eyes closed, I perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes of intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. After some 2 hours, this condition faded away. Curious about this experience and the extreme potency of just trace amounts, Hoffman decided to self-experiment by swallowing 250 micrograms mixed with water. He left work early and rode home on his bicycle with a colleague. As example to the enduring cult legacy of psychedelic history, the anniversary of Hoffman's first trip is celebrated by psychedelic enthusiasts on April 19th, called Bicycle Day. Initially haunted by paranoia and demonic visions, Hoffman thought he was having a mental breakdown. Eventually, he came to enjoy the experience. Hoffman believed that there was, to my knowledge, no other known substance that evoked such profound psychic effects in such extremely low doses that caused such dramatic changes in human consciousness and our experience of the inner and outer world. Sandoz Labs invested in Hoffman's discovery and began to circulate samples of the pharmaceutical to researchers in hopes of finding out more about this powerful drug and its psychological effects. From Sandoz Labs in Switzerland, LSD traveled to the United States. In 1949, Dr. Max Rinkel, a neuropsychiatrist in Boston, was the first to import the drug from Sandoz into the US. Though California would later become the iconic landscape of the psychedelic 60s, our very dear Boston figures very prominently in this early story of LSD. By 1943, Sandoz formally partnered with the National Mental Health Institute and the FDA to distribute LSD to interested researchers for purposes of analytic psychotherapy. Psychiatrists like Werner Stoll, Humphrey Osmond, and John Smith began to explore its use for the treatment of alcoholism, addiction, trauma, neuroses, and anxiety, that familiar string of modern illnesses. Initially, researchers thought LSD mimicked psychosis and could offer psychiatrists a window into the world of the schizophrenic. Though the psychosis model for LSD was gradually disproved, the association with mental illness and psychotic breakdown continues to haunt psychedelics in the cultural imagination. These early researchers were finding promising therapeutic uses and building ever new knowledge about the biochemistry of the brain and the neurological workings of consciousness. Psychedelic research was being conducted quite quietly in the medical community without much attention until a famous English author read a scientific article on the use of mescaline by Humphrey Osmond in 1952. LSD had renewed researchers' interest in mescaline, which had been long used in Native American medicinal and spiritual practice because of its hallucinogenic properties. Aldous Huxley, most famous for his dystopian novel Brave New World, was vastly curious about altered states from his research in theology, psychology, neuroscience, and his lifelong meditation practice. Huxley wrote to Osmond, and after some correspondence, invited him to visit in Los Angeles. He proposed that Osmond might, quote, bring a little mescaline, for I am eager to make the experiment and would feel particularly happy to do so under the supervision of an experienced investigator like yourself. Osmond was currently seeking trial subjects, particularly in individuals with the power of description, much like Huxley. Huxley was, in his own words, on the spot and willing, indeed eager to be a guinea pig. Osmond, whose research was based in Saskatchewan, Canada, flew across the US border with a bottle of mescaline in his luggage. Mescaline was legal at the time. The resultant experiment inspired Huxley's first book on psychedelics, The Doors of Perception, published in 1954. In the next year, Huxley tried LSD with longtime colleague Gerald Hurd and Al Hubbard, another central figure in the history of psychedelic distribution. Captain Al Hubbard, nicknamed Captain Trips and described as the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, traveled around the US in the early 1960s, giving away thousands of samples of LSD to businessmen, scholars, politicians, and artists, even pairing up with AA founder Bill Wilson. Hubbard formerly worked for the Office of Secret Services and may have had ties with the CIA's secret MK-Ultra research on behavioral engineering. The CIA gave its psychedelics and other pharmaceutical drugs to unsuspecting civilians in illegal studies of mind control. Huxley was very concerned about these very possibilities, even as he saw psychedelics as a real potential tool. After his LSD experiment, he wrote another short book on psychedelics called Heaven and Hell, with the headlines from the CIA. Heaven and Hell in 1956. The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell are often published together and are arguably the most influential aesthetic and theoretical statements on psychedelics in the 20th century. The Osmond-Huxley collaboration yielded a rich dialogue between the arts and the sciences. They form one of the most important nodes of psychedelic virality. In fact, the term psychedelic itself was coined by this interdisciplinary pair. Huxley and Osmond were dissatisfied with the terms of their day. Osmond suggested psychedelics, from the Greek, meaning mind manifesting. In an exchange of letters, Osmond penned a couplet to remind Huxley of the spelling. To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. Though the proper terminology is still debated, psychedelic caught on as the key word of the 60s generation and remains the dominant label for these substances. Huxley's account of his mescaline and LSD trips captivated audiences, enticing some readers with his suggestion that these drugs might offer a glimpse into the worlds of artists like William Blake, Vermeer, and Beethoven. Quoting Huxley, I might so change my ordinary mode of consciousness as to be able to know from the inside what the visionary, the medium, and even the mystic were talking about. His texts provide audiences a representational map of altered states. Huxley makes psychedelic emotions and visions recognizable to unfamiliar readers through fantastic symbols and realist detail. The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell became bestsellers in the 1950s and 60s and have remained continually in print ever since. Huxley's turn to psychedelic subjects was met with mixed reviews. The German novelist Thomas Mann regarded The Doors of Perception as, quote, unscrupulous aesthetic self-indulgence, the most audacious form of Huxley's escapism, an irresponsible book which will only contribute to the stupefaction of the world. Though Mann did reluctantly admit, well encouraged by the persuasive recommendation of the famous author, many Englishmen and especially Americans will try the experiment, for the book sells like hotcakes. A few short years later, in 1960, Huxley was invited to be a visiting professor at MIT. A mile and a half down the Charles River, Huxley's path intersected with another central node of psychedelic history, the psilocybin project at Harvard University, headed by Timothy Leary and Richard Albert. Through the Center of Personality Research, Leary and Albert investigated the psychological effects of psilocybin, the psychoactive element in some mushroom species. Huxley became an advisor on the project, helping Leary and Albert work out a non-clinical, supportive, safe, yet scientifically rigorous framework for psychedelic experimentation. Leary and Albert tested psilocybin and LSD on their colleagues, often conducting experiments in their Newton homes. They had found that the clinical hospital and lab environments were not always conducive to the kinds of sensory and emotional experiences psychedelics entailed. Once these drugs moved out of the clinical space of the hospital and into private homes, their spread into the public sphere grew exponentially. Leary and Albert's research gained national attention in 1963 when Harvard administration fired Leary for shirking his teaching duties and Albert for giving psilocybin to undergrads. This was the first major scandal in psychedelic history, appearing in headlines across the nation. Leary and Albert, who later took the name Ram Dass, became very public advocates for psychedelic use. Along with Ralph Metzer, Madison Presnell, Houston Smith, Gunther Weil, and others, Leary and Albert formed the International Federation for Internal Freedom, an organization to devoting the right to consciousness-expanding practices. As the 60s moved on, Leary took center stage, presenting himself as a psychedelic guru and spiritual leader. Leary's famous slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out, became a catchphrase. His public advocacy came with a price: federal suspicion, criminal charges, and imprisonment. Many psychedelic researchers today distance themselves from the Leary legacy, somewhat understandably. Leary's advocacy for psychedelics sometimes reached exaggerated and inaccurate proportions, and may have encouraged people who were not psychologically prepared to take the drug under unadvisable circumstances. Huxley and Leary formed two central nodes of that first phase of psychedelic virality. Americans read The Doors of Perception and news coverage on the Leary research scandal, heard interviews of the two over TV and radio, sparking curiosity and conversation across the nation. Amidst this growing noise, there emerged the work of some of our nearly forgotten figures in psychedelic history, like Adele Davis and Thelma Moss. Under the influence of LSD, lying on therapist's couch with an eye shade over their eyes and music playing in the background, Adele Davis transformed into a glowing silkworm, and Thelma Moss became a clam at the bottom of the sea. They recorded their therapeutic LSD experiences for psychiatric research studies, and later they published their accounts under pseudonym. Adele Davis's Exploring Inner Space by Jane Dunlap was published in 1961, and Thelma Moss's Myself and I by Constant Newland appeared the following year. They were bestsellers of their time, reviewed by major papers and journals, but have curiously dropped out of our historical picture. One reviewer in the New York Times may have warned off readers. The books were, quote, not for the kiddies, especially the sweet girl graduates. The back cover of the 1962 copy of Myself and I prophesizes the viral spread to come. This book is the true story of one woman's experiences with LSD, the new, experimental, and dangerous mind drug that is exploding into use across America. That same year, the philosopher Alan Watts published Joyous Cosmology, a photo essay on his use of psychedelics. Scholarly interest and public awareness of psychedelics grew rapidly in this early part of the 60s. And while Alan Watts, Huxley, and Leary are all well remembered, women like Dunlap and Newland played an instrumental role in the popularization of psychedelic subjects. They presented these experiences in richly effective terms, eliciting the empathy of their readers on an emotional level. Affect, the capacity to feel and to share in another's feeling, are all central to viral phenomena. Emotions compel audiences to pass messages on. Like viral social protest campaigns, the psychedelic aesthetic uses empathy as a rhetorical appeal, much like the consciousness-raising rhetoric of the civil rights, women's, and anti-war movements of that same decade. By the mid-1960s, psychedelic culture began to splinter into two directions, the scientific and the countercultural. These two modes are, however, very difficult to untangle in the case of psychedelic history, as we'll see in the example of Oscar Yangier, the Beverly Hills psychiatrist who gave LSD to actors, writers, and artists to study the effects of creative production. In doing so, he turned on the Hollywood set, reportedly administering the drug to actors Cary Grant, James Colburn, Jack Nicholson, and the novelist Anais Nin. Once LSD became a cause celeb, there was no stopping its spread. Meanwhile, in visual art and cinema, artists like John and James Whitney, Jordan Belson, and Stan Brakhage began building a new library of abstract visual effects that replicated psychedelic experiences. Screened at small theaters and private houses, experimental films from the mid-1950s and early 60s, like Kenneth Anger's The Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, Stan Brakhage's Dog Star Man, Ron Rice's Chumlum, had limited distribution, but were praised by critics. Another forgotten figure that I'd hoped to recover is Storm DeHirsch and her avant-garde film Peyote Queen from 1957. The use of day-glow color schemes, otherworldly imagery, abstract expressionist techniques developed alongside new technological advancements in liquid light and sound projectors. Strobe and light projectors were used to disrupt audiences' perceptual sense of space. Music played with their sense of time and duration through mixed overlap tracks and program lags and delays. Light shows became a ubiquitous part of the underground club scenes of San Fran and New York. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters ramped up the psychedelic spread with their travel across the country on a magic-painted school bus named Further. As Tom Wolfe recounts in his classic 1967 New Journalist novel, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, the merry pranksters took a road trip across America, turning people on to the psychedelic aesthetic and sometimes even the drug itself. I'll be giving a talk on Ken Kesey at the Spectacular Conference. Just a plug. Based in the San Fran area, the pranksters helped create the Haight-Ashbury scene. They teamed up with the Grateful Dead and Bill Graham of the Fillmore to stage their famous acid tests. These multimedia concerts, light shows, and performances sometimes included gallons of fruit juice spiked with LSD. Talk about a difficult case to study viral spread. Will we ever really know who drank the Kool-Aid? This LSD was often supplied by underground chemist Augustus Owsley Stanley III, known simply as Owsley. Owsley was connected with many of the major psychedelic figures of the West Coast scene, including Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and the Grateful Dead, as you see here. Word spread of the psychedelic experimentation and radical lifestyles flourishing out west. Many affluent, young, mostly white, adults, dissatisfied by the conformity of the suburbs, made pilgrimage to the countercultural centers of New York, LA, and San Fran. In a 1967 article entitled The Hippies, Time magazine reported, whatever their meaning, and wherever they may be headed, the hippies have emerged on the US scene in about 18 months as a wholly new subculture, a bizarre permutation of the middle-class American ethos from which it evolved. The spread of hippie culture across the American population, of course, involved more than psychedelics, and part of my larger project is actually to put psychedelics back into context with the social justice movements of the decade. So seemingly overnight, LSD became America's phantom problem. LSD and marijuana use made national headlines. Not everyone approved of psychedelics. A great deal of the country remained socially and religiously conservative, viewing hippie counterculture as a dangerous fringe element, contaminating American wholesomeness. Even some liberals feel psychedelics would compromise the promising reforms of LBJ's Great Society. Acid panic was in the air, the media sensation was overhyped, blowing out minor incidences into fictions of alarming proportion. There were news reports of college students jumping out of windows, of suicides and mental breakdowns. Two stories kept recirculating the national newspapers: a 5-year-old girl who accidentally ate a spiked sugar cube, and a man who murdered his mother-in-law while flying on LSD. The subsequent trial found that the man had long suffered from chronic paranoid schizophrenia. Young women carted off to the mental hospital. That image became a repeated meme in psychedelic virality. Some tabloid photos of LSD headlines. While there is certainly some risk with these drugs, particularly in contaminated substances made by amateur chemists, high dosage, unprepared individuals, unsuitable environments, suicide or violent side effects are extremely rare. Psychedelic use was reportedly sweeping the country, yet there was actual little documented evidence on the scope of use and the long-term effects. This uncertainty was in part due to the silence bred from fear of taboo and later criminal penalty. Only a brave few were going on record. Newspaper stories warned, the nation's colleges and universities are shadowboxing with a phantom of the campus, the potential threat of the hallucination drug LSD. Yet university officials admitted that they really had almost no idea how many students were taking LSD. The only major consensus was that there was more unknown about psychedelics than was known, and that remains the same today. Yet this did not stop the media machine from wild speculation. Some news outlets were more responsible in their coverage. Time and Life magazine publisher Henry Luce and his wife Claire Booth Luce had taken LSD and helped publish more balanced articles on the subject. The viral media hype about psychedelics eventually had disastrous effects on the legitimate research studies. Amidst this controversy, Sandoz halted production on LSD in 1965 and essentially turned the market over to underground chemists. Responding to public concern, Senator Robert Kennedy led congressional hearings on the FDA regulation of LSD in 1966. Kennedy invited several prominent researchers and government officials to testify on the uses and abuses of LSD. The committee heard repeated expert testimony on LSD's limited physiological and psychological harm, its non-addictive nature, and its therapeutic value. But the drug was still viewed as dangerous. Psychedelic experiences are shown to potentially produce, at times, radical shifts in values and worldviews, as reflected in Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff's fearful remarks. We aren't dealing with aspirin here, or with a cure for the common cold. We are dealing with compounds which have fantastic social implications that the old medicines do not have. What are these fantastic social implications that Ribicoff mentions? A greater sense of compassion, an impulse towards peaceful coexistence, a rejection of capitalist affairs, a desire for simple lifestyles? These sometimes romantic countercultural values did not exactly fit the mission of post-war global capitalism and the American military industrial complex at the time. In 1966, one government official called LSD, quote, the greatest threat facing the country today, more dangerous than the Vietnam War. The congressional trials resulted in legislation that banned LSD in California and many other states. Despite Congress's acknowledgement of its therapeutic value, LSD was later classified as a legal Schedule I drug in 1970. According to the Controlled Substances Act, and as enforced by the DEA, Schedule I drugs are those that have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Consider the most dangerous drugs with potentially severe psychological or physical dependence. Schedule I drugs come with the stiffest criminal penalties. So LSD, marijuana, ecstasy, peyote are all currently listed along the very addictive, physiologically harmful, and potentially fatal substances like quaaludes and heroin. The reactionist drug war, like prohibition during the 1920s, has resulted in increased violent crime, new underground economies, mass imprisonment of young Black and Hispanic men, and little impact on the amount of drug use. As we've seen over the last few years in marijuana reform, it may be a big time to reopen the conversation on these substances, about why humans have long sought these altered states, and how we can pursue such use safely and responsibly. After the congressional trials, psychedelic culture spikes tremendously. Media coverage accelerated the speed to distant networks across the country. Hollywood stars like Peter Fonda and Jack Nicholson starred in films like Roger Corman's The Trip and Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider, and popularized the psychedelic aesthetic for mainstream audiences. The psychedelic aesthetic was eventually taken up by the marketing machine, appearing in advertisements for Campbell's Soup, dry cleaning, Pepsi, and even Best Western hotels. Gradually, the penalties mounted. The aesthetic grew commercially cliched, and the generational mood shifted. By the mid-1970s, music and fashion turned to disco and punk, and the drugs of choice became cocaine, amphetamines, and heroin. So why and how did psychedelic use spread in the 1960s? Answering the how, Terence McKenna makes the provocative connection between LSD's physical materiality, measured in micrograms, and its rapid spread. The surge in media coverage produced acid panic and psychedelic curiosity, perhaps inspiring more people to try the drug than would have otherwise. To answer the why question, it seems that a generation was looking for alternative modes of consciousness and identity that went beyond the constrictive race, gender, and class relations of their time. In the haunting shadow of World War II and the Holocaust, and the still looming Cold War threat of nuclear annihilation, and crippling censorship of the McCarthy era, is it any wonder that people were searching, not only for an escape, but for new ways of relating to one another on a personal and societal basis? Do these same imperatives persist with us today? Initially, government officials dismissed LSD as a short-lived trend. In 1966, National Institute of Mental Health Director Stanley Yoles said LSD was a fad like goldfish swallowing, and another compared it to smoking banana peels. I don't know many goldfish swallowers or banana smokers, but I do see a continued robust interest in psychedelics today. Though we see a viral spike in the 60s, psychedelic culture has remained underground all along. New synthetic compounds are developed by amateur chemists, and psychedelic aesthetic persists in popular culture. The 1990s saw another brief resurgence in such use in the form of MDMA, or E, or ecstasy as it's popularly called. The center of this network was the British acid house and techno scene called the Second Summer of Love. Today, we see another renaissance in psychedelic use, culture, and scientific research. Electronic dance music and festivals are popular among today's youth, and often paired with the use of Molly, another variant of MDMA. We sometimes see headlines that eerily echo the psychedelic panic of the 1960s. But even more importantly, new research on psychedelics is finally being approved, and a wealth of new studies show the beneficial therapeutic use of psychedelics like LSD and MDMA for coping with addiction, PTSD, anxiety, and depression from terminal illness. Much of this research has been supported by the advocacy work of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. There's a really excellent Reddit AMA thread by Rick Doblin from MAPS that I should check out, so search those words. Psychedelics in the arts and sciences are on the rise again. How will we treat their viral spread this time? In closing, I'd like to end on a speculative note, a bit of psychedelic experimentation, if you will. Examining psychedelics through the lens of virality raises some interesting questions about the work we do as theorists, as the observers of patterns, networks, and connection. Could psychedelic ideas in art help scholars imagine the dynamics of viral spread, of our networked life, of our chaotically patterned universe? Several notable innovators in science and technology, including neuroscientist John Lilly, biochemist Carrie Mullis, and physicist Richard Feynman, admit that LSD and other psychedelics played a significant role in their intellectual discoveries. Steve Jobs credits LSD as one of the most important things he's done in his life. Is there a connection, then, between psychedelic insight and the ability to perceive new patterns in connection? Could the cosmic molecular perceptions of psychedelics help us better imagine life on a global scale? As we trace out viral networks, might psychedelics remind us that much still remains outside our perceptual blinders? Are we struck by virality because it offers some psychedelic glimmer of transcendental immanence, a sense of greater global or cosmic force beyond our alienated modern selves? Like these new viral theories and phenomena, the study of psychedelics offers a glimpse of the universe in its infinite complexity, yet makes us ever more aware of what we have not yet to encounter, of what we can only barely see shimmering on the networked horizon. Thank you.
So Lana and Nicole, you'll take questions together?
Sure.
This question is for both of you. I assume, and this may be a wrong assumption, well, A, it may be a wrong assumption, B, you've partly answered this in both of your papers, but I'd be curious to hear more about it. I assume that you were not necessarily conceptualizing your work in terms of virality before you were drawn to, before it was sort of suggested, and then you were drawn into the fellowship group. And I guess I'm wondering, just in general terms, sort of, this is a thing, right? People put themes up and then we start thinking about how our work might benefit by intersecting with those themes and other people who are thinking along those thematic lines whom we might not have thought of before. And I guess I'm wondering if you can both speak a little bit to both the ways it maybe helped you to frame or reframe your work, and then what were the sort of potential distractions or obstacles to that kind of reframing.
Okay, well, I mean, I mentioned a couple of them in the talk, and I had been thinking about at least the circulation of the historical narratives in terms of virality. I mean, it's not that exact term. I was using words like the rhizome and multiply disseminated, right? This kind of language, which is very similar to virality. And I mean, there's also, as I said in the talk, right, the connection with the rhetoric of slavery in the 19th century. That's this insidious disease, right?
Yeah.
And then finding it very interesting that same rhetoric is coming back in terms of the discussion of modern slavery. So, I mean, for me, what was useful was the nebulousness of the initial definition of virality. So as I said, when when the scientists in the group, said, this is not how we understand virality. We actually understand it in very different kinds of ways. That was useful to me because the sharing, part of it, of the contemporary notion of virality, just was, as I said, very unsatisfying and seemed really to rub up wrongly against the neo-slave narrative and the notions of the neo-slave narrative. So yeah, it's very useful. I'm still going back and forth in terms of whether it's going to show up in the introduction. This comes from the introduction on this talks. So it does feel kind of trendy, to be using virality. So I'm on the fence. I'm not sure if it's going to show up in the book or not.
Yeah, I feel like I can't quite use the term with real certainty anymore because of our collaboration with our colleagues in the sciences until I've mapped out kind of numerically what this really spread looked like. I have a hunch that it spread virally, it seems to do so. But the viral model helped me really think about clusters or nodes or networks and how, especially since my project's very multimedia, about how those are kind of intersecting or congregating in particular areas or times around certain kinds of media that I wasn't aware of before. And it allowed me just to see that kind of how they're mutating and changing over this period in different ways.
Yeah, that's the key part for me as well. The mutation aspect of it, and that it pushes against the progressive logic and the teleology of going from the historical narratives to the fictional narratives. So there was this wonderful nebulousness to virality that I was finding very useful.
And this is for both of you as well. As you're talking about virality, you're talking about it as very human-centered, and I'm wondering if in your research or as you're thinking about this or in your group, you thought about non-human agents at those nodes or various points in the network and how they might have participated. I'm thinking of Bruno Latour's work, and if you thought about the non-human at all.
Could you say a little bit more about the non-human? What do you mean? Do you mean like animals?
Well,
or what?
I don't know. I'm thinking with respect to LSD, how you might actually attribute some sort of agency to a chemical, okay? And how that circulates and forms its own nodes, and what non-human entities in the story of slavery that would involve ships, cargoes, chains, stuff.
Yeah.
With, just beyond the kind of LSD part, actually several people have made that kind of speculation that the chemicals or plant life themselves have impelled their own spread. I actually refer you to Richard Doyle's most recent book, Darwin's Pharmacy, about that very subject. So that they might, like we talked about Albert Hoffman's sort of sheer accidental discovery that this situation kind of might have been created by itself by the plants or the molecules. I'm not sure, I haven't quite done enough research on that, but that I thought about more of the non-human in terms of the laws, which brings us back to the human, but these legislative moments where they're trying to stamp down the spread and actually makes it spike up incredibly until those penalties get more severe and then we see the drop. So I think virality also helped me see the infrastructures and the role that media played and the legislative played, in addition to looking at the literature, which my English background had trained me for. And I think this conversation helped me see those other kinds of infrastructures.
Yeah, I think in terms of neo-slave narrative, it's a little more difficult to talk about the non-human. I think that it is helpful in terms of my argument looking at the non-scribal neo-slave narrative, right? So thinking about the ways in which visual artists, architects, for example, so the ways in which architects, just take that example, are working with space, right? And how the notion of space might be conveyed in the neo-slave narrative in terms of, right, owning your space, living in the same space in which, right, horrible things had happened, things like that. I think so. It's one of the benefits of virality is it makes those kinds of connections a little easier to make, right?
Question. So it seems like both your projects really draw from, and I think understandably given the fellowship and how you're all put together in sort of an interdisciplinary group, that a lot of the subjects you're looking at, the people are working in interdisciplinary ways. Do you have any reflection now after going through this year working with an interdisciplinary project like this, new respect maybe for those people that formed the nodes that Lana talks about through interdisciplinary collaboration? I know I talk about it a lot in my research too, but I think that maybe you might have another perspective on what that work actually looks like on the ground, maybe since you've experienced it over the last year.
Yeah, it's definitely, it sounds great, right? But it's definitely harder than I had anticipated. I do come from an interdisciplinary background in that my BA is in art history, and I've always brought in art in terms of every project that I've encountered. But so I had this perception of interdisciplinarity in my head in terms of how I do interdisciplinariness, but that is not how, right? Everyone does interdisciplinariness. So it was definitely a I'll say it was a challenge, but it was a fun challenge. I will say completely, totally honestly, when Justin shared the R Not article, I rolled my eyes and thought, oh my God, this is scientific writing. I'm not going to get into it. It's going to be boring and dry. I'm not going to get anything out of it. But it was actually really, really interesting, and it really changed my mind about the definition of virality. That that it could actually be useful if I went back to the quote unquote original definition. And it's something that I'm still working on. So I'm still very interested in working across disciplines in order to more effectively, right, address the questions that I'm trying to address, because the project itself is interdisciplinary, and so I really need to come out of the English department's wheelhouse and be a little more open-minded.
Yeah, I would agree that it presents both challenges, I think, especially when it came down to like methodologies and tools, and though those methodologies and tools are not ones I want to adopt, but have to recognize when they're a supplement or adjunct to my work rather than like the primary focus, because I am, in humanities and this is an English project, right? But that reading work from the other disciplines actually sometimes helped really refine my interest, because I noticed like what I was noticing in that like same scientific R0 paper, like just what jumps out at you helps you like kind of re-see like, okay, this is what I'm interested in. I'm interested in these kinds of connections, or I'm interested in like how things are like spreading from people to people. And then the other stuff you can kind of like put your blinders on for a moment. But actually, this is a really provocative question, and it's been one that we've continued throughout our time here, and it is the topic of that special symposium that's on the back of your program, which I very much invite you to attend on April 3rd.
So I have a question that's particularly for Lana. You mentioned a few books by women about LSD experiences, and I wondered how, if you had any sense of how widely read that they were at the time, and then if you were surprised by the ways that your research sort of intersected with this early psychiatry therapeutic model research, or if that was something that you were already looking for.
It was something that was surprising to me. I mean, initially when I conceived of this project, I didn't know it would both intersect with the sciences so much, nor with psychology. And that, like, Freud and Jung, like, are major keywords, especially in that chapter. The books themselves, how widely read, I've yet to being able to even track down their, like, publication histories, because, like, I found, like, one copy on Amazon, like, this is the extent of these books. But they're cited in other people's reviews. They usually get a sentence in psychedelic history, if they get it at all. And people say that they were widely read and they were bestsellers. So I'm going off of that as far as the bestseller part. But they were all reviewed in the New York Times, the British Journal of Psychiatry, and other academic sort of psychology journals. So they were treated very initially as like psychological, scientific documents, and then became kind of like really interesting memoirs about like, you know, Myself and I is about like finding the female orgasm, and you know, my Jane Dunlap's Exploring Inner Space is about, you know, feeling your people in Africa and people you're in South America, and feeling like really connected to these people across the globe, no matter the race. That's obviously problematic in this time, but it's provocative, and I think they're really underknown and underread, and I'd like to get them back into print.
So I don't have a fully formulated question here, but I've been troubling some kind of question around metaphor and connotation. And in particular, while we were talking about virality, I mean, I was stuck on how viral used to be bad and now it's good. You know, how it made that flip. And listening to you, Lana, I was thinking about how there was part of what you describe without completely naming it is how the appropriation of this, of the public presentation of LSD was all about making something that everybody was saying was this, this, and this into something that was dangerous. So from popularity to addiction, from which, you know, the one may be good and the other is bad. I mean, and even like one's reception of those colors. You know, like you feel a shift in your apprehension of it from the nostalgic, you know, and then it got sort of tired and silly and so and here, and viral is just a metaphor. It's a model and a metaphor, and we could have chosen, you know, another, for you it could be, you know, sort of popularity, and you talked about circulation, and so you make it into a question, but I
think virality does kind of capture that thread of contagion, right? That feeling that like this is gonna affect America and like ruin all of our lives. And that I think viral also captures the like real speed or the seeming speed of this spread and the way that it's popping up in newspapers. And I think that there's actually something about that speed and the way that it's traveling across these networks so quickly that actually doesn't let those metaphors or symbols settle. That, I mean, it's a, you know, argument from the humanities of like the long thought, you know, the time to like carefully think through and debate and talk through. That if it's, the message is going so quickly, can we control it? And that's where I feel like it jumps from like this promising, you know, new therapy to like a sacrament to this like poisonous chemical, all really rapidly within a couple of years.
I think for me, I mean, I don't know if it came across, but I moved away from using the virality as a metaphor and using it as a chronotope, which was more useful for me because I mean, I'm not really focused on, I'm using virality in various, you know, numerous ways. So not only to talk about the circulation right across the globe, right, and how these things move across the globe and how they spread or how they're diffused across the globe, but also how other media, right, appropriate that genre. So how that genre, so how it jumps genres as well. And then there's also the question of time and space that I had to account for. And so metaphor, just in terms of right, connection to description, just was not enough. Whereas thinking about the chronotope, right, which fuses time and space, allows me to acknowledge the connections between the historical narratives as well as the ways in which the new narratives are trying to insert themselves in these larger, right, political conversations. So, right, the you know, chronotope is a figure, right? It's a trope, right? So it there seems to be a greater multiplicity or, let's say, descriptive capacity in that terminology that I found more useful than just metaphor. But that may be my usual like crit background, right, kicking into gear.
Actually, you made me think about the cultural construction of the acid trip, because people were prepared and trained. Oh, are you seeing trails yet?
Yeah.
And so it became a kind of code. Oh, nice trails. And so if you lacked the trail gene, or if you didn't learn how to see trails or feel like you were 4 feet off the ground or whatever, but people were teaching each other, and maybe that's one of the ways that LSD went viral, is that they taught each other how to have a trip.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in that, the rhetorical sort of programming that happens with this literature and in the film, and how it instructs people about an experience that's like highly individual and so dependent on the circumstances. Yeah, there's this attempt to really kind of contain the narrative, but then it just, as it's going across the globe in all of these different contexts, across a strata of a population, like inevitably it just kind of multiplies the types of forms, and eventually it becomes kind of hard to even like classify, like these are the common features of the psychedelic aesthetic. It really,
Yeah, actually one of the things that occurred to me when listening to Lana's project and talking with her over the course of the seminar or the fellowship is thinking about what psychedelia looks like outside of the United States, and whether or not, right, because I mean, clearly it would have circulated, right, and disseminated, and so, is it the same, psychedelia in India, psychedelia in Jamaica, or, Nigeria, or, is it different, how is it different, so.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because it's like, what's, a virus, you can talk about its symptoms, and it's shared, but if you're, sharing a trip is not sharing a trip, and it's so individuated, and then it's not a virus, right?
I was wondering if you could say something a bit more about the way in which science and humanities talk to each other in relation to this. I mean, one of the things you get from listening to you and reading this little description here is the sense of kind of learning from the scientists what a virus is, and then adapting the metaphor to make it sort of, in a sense, more real. Like this is what a virus really means, so let's do it that way. I wonder if there was something going the other way as well, in terms of the science. I don't know, you might not be able to answer this, but the scientists.
There are people in the audience.
All right, the scientists at the front here, thinking more metaphorically about viruses in a sort of because you don't need to think metaphor doesn't need to work on the basis of a kind of real root and a fantastic, whatever the opposite of root in the metaphor is, the target domain. So how did that work? I mean, was there a sense of waiting for the scientists to tell you what a virus was and then working with it, or?
Well, no, it was having an idea about what the virus was, and then seeing how the very different way in which scientists talked about it, defined it, and then used it. So Sarah had given us the copy of Bruno Latour's essay about the laboratory, and so looking at and reading that and thinking about the very the different ways in which the work that goes on in the laboratory operates, and the very different way in which humanists talk about their work, right, which in pretty singular kinds of ways. And so it was interesting to me how that seemed to be the reverse of what I expected, right, because the idea is that science is so much more singular than the humanities, right, there's always a right answer. Whereas at least the Latour article in talking about laboratories seemed to complicated that for me. For me, working with the scientists has been incredibly helpful for helping me to see and notice things differently. I'm not sure with the scientists.
Can you go speak to that?
Well, I'm a faux scientist, I guess. For me, this whole project has been really interesting because as far as constructing interdisciplinarity in my work, it's always been focused on trying to do a project together. And so it was very strange to come together around a metaphor. And in part, I think some of this I've just been thinking in my head about the structure of this process, and it's been very difficult to just create the time to really think about how we would, I think interdisciplinary work to really work actually has to have an object that you're trying to produce together so that you can actually confront your moments of difference. And one of the kind of recommendations I would say for next year is to move us away from presentations in the second round where we're immediately forced back into producing something within our discipline so rapidly within a year that there's not really the space and time to really work on thinking together. or making an alternative set of things together. So it was kind of a struggle, I think, just in having the time and then the structure of this process of moving immediately back into giving a talk about your own work. Kind of, I think, kind of limited the conversation. I think prematurely for me, but I'm not sure if that's really an answer. But I'm not sure we really had enough time to or an object to work
A
collectively.
shared problem,
Yeah.
or question that you were trying to
Yeah.
answer together.
Yeah, that it quickly spiraled into, well, how am I using virality in my work? And it's hard to sort of push on that object in that framework. I thought, but Justin actually is a real scientist.
I'm more of a statistician than a scientist, but I found my experience was slightly different in. I found it fairly difficult to. I found it easier to start trying to convince other people of statistics than to change my research to include more of humanities. I'm a biostatistician, so as applied as statistics are, I'm even one degree more applied than statisticians, as I'm an applied statistician. So I am, by my nature, most biostatisticians would consider themselves interdisciplinary in their research, but we think of interdisciplinary as I work with epidemiologists and doctors and health researchers, all sort of in the realm generally of public health research. It's very rare to spend a lot of time with people doing research in law and public policy, in English, in sociology, but it's not unheard of, and in fact I've done a little bit of work with criminologists, and it's analyzing data. It's all just a matter of trying to figure out what the metaphor is. It's when you're looking, whether I'm looking for a cluster of disease, or whether I'm looking for a cluster of crime, or whether I'm looking for a cluster of culture, how can we measure? So what I found really interesting about this collaboration was trying to introduce some sort of rigor into the measurement, into the definition of virality, into the, let's think about what are the nodes of spreading, what is, if we're thinking, can I take the viral from the even getting rid of the metaphor, if I could take the idea of virality of viruses, of disease spreading throughout a susceptible population, how can we take that and think about this idea of the aesthetic of psychedelics spreading throughout a susceptible population, and what are the similarities, and how can we take one from the other? And it's a little harder to sort of, especially I tend to work on methodologies, so I like to push numbers and symbols around, and it's harder to bring the humanities into that, but it has helped me think about these problems slightly differently. Mm-hmm. And it's also sort of helped me just think about, what is important when we're measuring things like virality, what you have to think about, and that's both Lana and Nicole sort of brought up this idea of what is virality appropriate, and I feel like I was like one of the stronger voices this whole time, being like, I don't know if virality is appropriate here, because and it's this thing of this cutoff of when is it viral, when is it not viral, and introducing these ideas of like measurement, and can we quantify things, can we put some sort of measurement on these? So I found it really interesting,
and just to, as much as I valued that scientific approach and those methodologies, I think it also reinvested, to me, the value of the humanities for speculative thought and for inventing new metaphors. The defense of the humanities.
engaging in both of these talks, and what's important about the humanities too, in the way in which, you know, we think about things like the value of neo-slave narratives and what they're saying to us, and you bring me back, Lana. So, thank you for this, and thank all of the fellows, and please join us on April 3rd.